Okay, and thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks for all of your online attention. So I will try to shed some light on privatization and choice, with the combination of which has been a really important development in Sweden for the last 3 decades. So this is not about innovation specifically, but privatization and choice are sort of underlying forces that can both drive innovation. And just as a short background, so this is a workshop co-organized by Sweden, Netherlands, and Switzerland. So there are about 1.2 million people in the Netherlands older than 80 years, about 800,000 people in Sweden, and 700,000 people in the Switzerland. And importantly, the group of people above 80 is growing. So in Sweden, it's predicted that this group will increase by 50% in the next 10 years. So Sweden will be in 10 years about where the Netherlands are today when it comes to the number of old people. And this is relevant here since about half of the people in this age group need elderly care in some form. And so here I have a bar chart of long-term care expenditure as a share of GDP. And what is included is government spending and spending in compulsory private insurance systems. And the Netherlands, as you may know, is the top spender in the world when it comes to long-term care. Sweden is close to that, 3.2% of GDP, 3.7% in the Netherlands. And Switzerland is about around the OECD average. But all 3 countries spend substantial resources on long-term care. And also, I mean, it's difficult to make cross-country comparisons of the quality and satisfaction of elderly care, but in all of the 3 countries, judging from available studies, old people are comparatively satisfied with life, internationally speaking. And so my topic today is privatization and choice. And I would like to use Sweden as a natural experiment here. Sweden is a country with really ambitious social goals, and with a lot of tax-financed services, not only in elderly care, but also in healthcare, in education, in preschools, in care for disabled people, and so on. So, particular to Sweden is that almost all elderly care is tax-financed. There is some privately financed care at the margin, but when I talk about the tax-financed part of it, which I will do here, it's really almost all of it, apart from informal care, of course. And then Sweden is special since around the 1990s. Sweden was special before that in that everything in the elderly care sector was handled by the public sector, by the municipalities and the regions. And since the 1990s, there has been a steady development with increasing privatization, increasing choice for users. And also an interesting aspect of this is that almost all of the new providers have been for-profit companies. There are also non-profits here, but they are really small compared with the for-profit providers. And I mean, so this has been a sort of controversial topic in Sweden, where some people embrace it, some people are really hostile towards it. But it has been difficult to evaluate this. So only recently there has been a wave of scientific studies and policy reports, so that it's much easier since a couple of years back to take stock of the evidence and evaluate this development. And so much of my talk here is based on a book forthcoming now in December with my colleague Morten Blix, Privatizing Welfare Services, Lessons from the Swedish Experiment. And so here we make such an evaluation of privatization in Swedish tax finance services, so including elderly care, but also the other parts of the Swedish welfare sector. And so elderly care mainly consists of home care services and nursing homes. There is also some short-term housing, but that's a really marginal part of the costs. And so here is the development of the private production shares in home care services and in nursing homes. The graphs begin in 1999, but the privatization really started off in 1989 in Sweden, in the municipality of Danderyd, a wealthy suburb to Stockholm. So before that, everything was carried out by the municipalities, but then after some experimentation and also legal battles, Danderyd managed to contract out home care to a private company. And it is the private company that has since then developed into Attendo. And then we had a sort of slow but steady increase in the private production shares. And in 2009, there was an important reform, the freedom of choice reform in English, or lagen om valfrihetssystem in Swedish. And this act confirmed that the municipalities, they do have the right to establish free choice systems. Many of them had done so by themselves already before that. And the act prescribed that such systems have to meet specific national standards for information, for market entry, and for choice. And looking at the development of private production, we can see also at a finer level than this graph that the free choice systems have increased privatization. So you get faster privatization with the free choice systems compared with privatization, compared with municipalities that use more procurement style elderly care. And yes. And so Danderyd showed the way, and the municipality was followed by a few other municipalities. This was mainly in and around Stockholm. And so interestingly, over time, we see a pattern of policy or privatization diffusion. So municipalities of different political color and economic situation have followed their neighbors. So you're much more likely as a municipality to try out private elderly care if a neighboring municipality has already done so. So we have seen clusters of privatization in Sweden, and I hope this will be demonstrated by clicking through the years. So you can see that the new privatizations happen close to the municipalities where it had already taken place. And so this was for elderly care. This was share of private employment in the elderly care sector. And this is different from other tax-financed welfare services, that here privatization in elderly care was for local development. And as I mentioned, the 2009 freedom of choice reform mostly confirmed the development that had already happened in many municipalities. So this has been sort of an organic development, privatization from below. And there are important regional differences. As you can see, this is almost about 40% of elderly care is in private hands in municipalities close to the major cities, whereas in countryside municipalities, private providers are still a marginal phenomenon, below 5%, both in nursing home and in home care services. And so evaluating this is tricky. As I said, most of the research has been in recent years. So elderly care then is an example of a so-called quasi-market, which means that you have both public and private providers competing for business and paid for by tax money. So the end users themselves do not pay for the services here within this Swedish system. As has been pointed out by economists, but also very often in the policy debate, quasi-markets come with a lot of potential problems. So there is asymmetric information, there are problems of incomplete contracts, switching costs can be high, and in particular quality is really difficult to measure, and that's sort of the main reason for contracts always being highly incomplete. Then on the other hand, privatization was a response when it initially happened. I started in '89, but also in the '90s. It was a response to dissatisfaction with an unresponsive public sector at that time. So elderly care, but also healthcare, education, there was this sort of one-size-fits-all solution where you couldn't sort of cater to minority preferences or develop your own method of delivery if you wanted to. And so comparing the private and public alternative, one should really avoid, and this is not at all always avoided, the so-called Nirvana fallacy. And you often hear people comparing an ideal state with a realistic alternative. So for instance, you say that, okay, we have this existing private sector with all flaws of the market, and then we compare that with an ideal, flawless public sector solution. Of course, that's an invalid argument, sort of. It's a form of a false comparison, but you hear that a lot. Alternatively, you could compare a market with perfect competition with the existing public sector, which is sort of also obviously a false comparison. And I'm an economist, and among economists, you often hear, also from teachers lecturing students and so on, that there are so-called market failures. And sort of that's a sufficient argument for political intervention. Of course, that's not really the case, because you can always have support for some theoretical argument that there is a problem on the market. And there will always be potential public sector interventions to deal with that. And the ultimate challenge is to evaluate or compare the existing public and private solutions empirically and find the dominant effects. And this is what so Morten Blix and I have done when compiling all of the recent research in our forthcoming book. And as an economist, I need to start with the costs. And here, what we can see is that the public providers seem to have slightly higher costs and therefore make losses in many municipalities. This is in home care. So an interesting feature with the freedom of choice system in home care is that the public and private providers should compete on an equal footing and be part of the same remuneration system. So the payment to private providers should equal the costs of the public providers. And so in such a system, you see whether the public providers are able to make to produce elderly care at the same costs as they pay to the private providers for the exact same 1 hour of service, say. And in many municipalities, we have seen that they are not able to deliver this service at the same cost. So there is a deficit that has to be covered by the end of the year. So private providers seem to have an advantage. Another important aspect is that it's, at least initially, with choice systems, there is a high risk of an increase in total costs because it's really difficult to ration and limit the delivered service within the choice system. So previously, when everything was conducted within the public sector, it didn't matter as much how many hours of home care a particular user was entitled to. So that was not really binding because sort of middle management in home care could always go in and ration the service if costs started to increase too fast. Now it's different, and in particular with the private companies. So if a care manager has decided that you are entitled to, say, 20 hours of home care every week, there is really no incentive for you, of course, as an elderly person or as your private provider to deliver less than that. And therefore, there is a sort of risk that costs will increase faster within a choice system. Of course, it's good that people get the services that they are entitled to. I'm not saying that, but we need to pay attention to the costs more than we did before, perhaps, when this sort of took care of itself within the public sector, although in a really opaque way. User satisfaction is, of course, important when evaluating different alternatives. Here, there has been a couple of comparisons, and we don't see any difference between private and public providers really when it comes to the satisfaction of the users at the national level. Stockholm is a possible exception, but it's an older study. But it could be the case that Stockholm, with the largest market, also largest private market, that the private providers have a bit more satisfied users, both in nursing home and in home care, than the public providers. So looking at the freedom of choice reform, this reform was introduced sequentially in the municipalities, which is an important feature because you can then more easily evaluate the consequences of the reform compared if you have a one-off reform nationally. And here we see that user satisfaction picks up slightly after a municipality has implemented the freedom of choice reform. So that's positive. And it's particularly positive since if we ask elderly people, it's really the case that choice opportunities are appreciated. That's sort of one thing that everybody agrees on, that they really value and appreciate the ability to make a choice, and if they are dissatisfied, to make a switch. The problem with user satisfaction is that it gives only a part of the picture. So maybe in home care you can say that so what you see is what you get, and there is not much more to home care quality than the satisfaction of the users. I would at least be willing to say that you get almost a complete quality picture by asking the users. With even older people in nursing home, it's more difficult because the healthcare component is more important. You might be satisfied with services in a nursing home, even if all of your medical needs have not been given proper attention, because it's really important to evaluate medical services as a consumer. And it's also the case, of course, that the quality of healthcare becomes fully apparent only later on. So we need other quality measures to complement the picture of usage choice, and especially in nursing homes. And going to objective quality measures, there is a big debate what are appropriate objective quality measures in elderly care, but we have looked at some of the established one that Swedish authorities publish and collect and publish. And here we see that if we look at structural quality indicators, that is the employees, the buildings, the resources, public nursing homes tend to score better on those quality indicators. And this is in particular for staffing. So there are more employees per elderly people in public nursing homes than in private nursing homes. Whereas private nursing homes really do better on process quality indicators, such as the medication reviews. And this difference is clearer, it's more marked compared with the difference on structural quality indicators. One reason might be that there has been some financial bonuses to providers who, for instance, perform medication reviews and similar reviews. And here, so it could just be that private companies are more sensitive to financial bonuses than public organizations are. And there has also been, there is a paper comparing nursing homes of different private ownerships types. So for profit nursing homes, non-profit ones, and there is really no difference there. You can also compare nursing homes run by so-called private equity companies with other private companies. There is also no quality difference, it seems, between those groups. And also with respect to profitability, which has been a big debate in Sweden. There was for many years a suggestion to cap profits in the private welfare sector. And so I have compared the quality indicators of nursing homes with respect to the profitability levels of the companies running them. And there are overall no quality differences between more and less profitable nursing homes here. If anything, a few indicators indicated higher quality in nursing homes run by more profitable companies. And an important study looking at the introduction of private nursing homes. So what happens after a municipality starts to or lets in the first private nursing home to operate in the municipality. And this has led to a clear improvement in productivity. So after the first privatization in a municipality, there has been a reduction in costs, but also a reduction in mortality among old people in this municipality. So here, especially with, mortality is important, of course, as such. It's sort of the ultimate thing that we would like to avoid. And it's also sort of, you get a lot of critique sometimes about private companies cutting corners and just sort of shirking on quality. So mortality is a measure that you cannot really shirk on, because if you don't miss in public register that people die. So if we observe mortality in a municipality, we have a really good overall measure about healthcare quality for the oldest people. So to conclude, privatization and choice have led to some improvements, that's clear, but it's also the case that challenges remain. Gatekeepers are needed. I mentioned the risk for spiraling costs, and it's also that municipalities really need to separate their role as at the system and provider levels. And this is because of the public loss making that I mentioned, that there is this risk that since the municipality, unlike private companies, can run deficits, they will be more willing to do so. So it's important that the same rules with regard to budgets apply for both public and private providers. And finally, rules must allow for private companies to introduce new technologies, also for them to introduce existing technologies that are often not adapted that rapidly into healthcare, elderly care. So here it's when designing payment systems, choice systems. Regulation is important, but there is a risk that regulation becomes a drag in that innovation is delayed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Henrik. Very interesting presentation, and we should remind our international viewers that this comparison between public and private providers, it's under the umbrella, as Henrik said, tax financed healthcare, health service, welfare service. So I think it's very interesting, Henrik, that this is in real life experiment, which we seldom do when it comes to developing organization. And that's also something which could be used when trying to implement new developments and new innovation. I also think it's very interesting that you were also focusing on costs, which we seldom do. We talk too little about output and costs, because we also have more room for innovation, of course, if you have an efficient organization. So thank you very much, Henrik, and I think it's very applicable when you talk about innovation. You have to have an efficient organization, and where one aspect is, of course, the ownership. Does it matter when it comes to cost, when it comes to quality, and also innovation opportunities? I know, Magnus, that we do have some Menti questions for Henrik, right?
Absolutely. First of all, it's great to see that you're using Menti so that we get a lot of good questions. There are some about costs and some about efficiency as well. So I will start off, Henrik, with what are relevant factors for differences in user satisfaction? Did your research show something regarding this question?
The relevant factor for user satisfaction?
Yes. Kind of an important one for the elderly, I guess.
Yes. I don't remember exactly now, so we used the overall user satisfaction when making this comparison. Of course, that can be divided into certain subcomponents, and I have to admit I don't remember exactly which components that drive user satisfaction. So as I mentioned from our research, it's the ability to make a choice is important, but I don't want to say anything in particular on the details of the services. No.
No worries. You will get that question answered on Twitter later, I guess, then. Okay. I take another one. Did quality of life indicators for residents increase in private-owned nursing homes?
Can you repeat that,
Did quality of life indicators for residents increase in private-owned nursing homes?
I don't know that either, I have to admit. So we had this, it's an increase in user satisfaction, and it's an increase in those objective quality measures. No, I don't know that either. I don't think that was covered in that research actually. So it's a good question that sort of remains to be answered.
Yeah, but it's good to see that there is. I mean, you raised a lot of questions, and that's always the important thing with having a good talk. I know that we need to move forward, Katarina. So I will just remind everybody of Menti and the code 2294355 is the way of reaching the question box. So please keep on using that. And thank you, Henrik.
Thank you.